Welcome to the Understanding Boys podcast. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which this podcast is recorded, the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. We pay respects to leaders past, present and emerging. The Understanding Boys podcast is a series of conversations exploring what it is to be a good man these days. So if you had a story about being a good man and that you could tell a 14-year-old boy and he'd actually listen, what would that story be? And that's really what I'm asking our guests today. I'm Dr. Ray Swan, and we're a community of teachers and parents concerned with the education and growth of boys in the modern world. The series is brought to you by Brighton Grammar, an all-boys school in Melbourne. To learn more about the podcast, please visit understandingboys.com.au. Welcome to the Understanding Boys podcast. Today we are interviewing Dr. Judy Chu. Judy is a lecturer in human biology at Stanford University. She earned her doctorate at Harvard, where she examined boys' gender socialisation, relationships and development during their early childhood and adolescence. Judy is an author of When Boys Become Boys, which focuses on the critical moment of transition in boys' lives and examines how they cope with identifying their place in society. Judy's work highlights boys' relational strengths and aims to foster their healthy resistance against societal pressures that can constrain their sense of integrity and hinder relationships. She has a fantastic insight into this area, and so join us as we delve into masculinity issues that are relevant to all young men and boys. Welcome, Dr. Judy Chu, to the Understanding Boys podcast. It's an absolute pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I wanted to talk to you firstly about your work that you're doing currently and also where you're based. I was very lucky to travel a couple of years ago now to Stanford, and I saw the amazing sculptures of Rodin and, went to the D School, and it's an open university. And something that also really struck me was it was founded by the then governor of California for his son, who died tragically, I think, of an illness at 15. And I was in the chapel there, and there's actually, you might be aware of it as well, there's a foundation stone which was laid there. And I just thought, wow, what an amazing gift to, future learners to set up an institution such as Stanford. It must be a great place to spend time. It
is. It's a beautiful campus. And the weather is pretty good. I mean, It's usually sunny and warm, which is really nice. But also, it sets a nice context for the students, I think. It's very conducive to kind of exploration and open conversations, and just everybody kind of feels good. And when people feel good, I think they're more open to kind of hearing different perspectives and exploring new things. And so I really love being on campus. I was there for my undergraduate studies as well. Right. And so very happy to be on campus always.
And did it feel, talking about the sort of the opportunities and the things that you've done, then going across to Harvard and studying with Carol Gilligan must have been quite an experience as well.
Yeah, I was, that was very lucky. I actually didn't go with the intention to study with her. And so we kind of met each other and had conversations. And then I was lucky enough that she was taking on new students, and we had conversations about the work she was doing with girls, which I had not actually learned as an undergraduate. So it was all new to me. And then the questions, that we discussed in office hours and things like that were just around like, has anyone looked at boys using these methods? And, one of the things that was so exciting about her work was she would just talk to these girls, without an agenda coming in, just kind of really trying to understand what was going on for them in their lives, what was important to them, what they were struggling with, and the kind of discoveries that turned out to be groundbreaking discoveries that emerged through that kind of, let's just get to know each other. Let's really trust that girls and boys can tell us about their experiences, and what can we learn from those insights, learning about their experiences from their perspectives. And of course, it resonated very well with not only the people like students and parents and educators who were reading their work, but also with kids in the studies, where they felt like finally their voices were being represented and that they were being seen and heard, and how valuable that was, both to, on the researcher side and educator side, but also to the participants in the studies. And so, it was really just a kind of series of fortunate events.
Fortunate
I was
events,
really lucky.
Unlike the lemon Snickers.
Exactly.
No, that's great. And with your work, how much has been design, I feel a calling to, obviously a clear calling to be a researcher and an academic, a clear calling to be involved at a community level. You know, we see you're also involved in Movember in terms of the research stuff, which hopefully we'll get an opportunity to chat about it later in our conversation, should there be time. But from your perspective, you know, from a vocational aspect, you know, I'm always curious to know, working in this space, you know, writing a book when boys become boys, you know, was this something that you kind of set yourself to, or has it just kind of come to you and met you along the road, so to speak? It's a pretty big question, I know. Start with the big ones, Judy.
No, again, I think I would kind of chalk it up to, it was very just lucky. I was really lucky. I certainly never thought I would write a book. I never thought I would study gender, actually. It was all just kind of things happening. I try to kind of reassure my students, you know, especially when they're finishing up their college careers and they're worried about needing to have their whole lives, you know, planned out ahead of them. And I tell them, you know what? It's great to have a plan, but it's also really good to be flexible, because you never know who you're going to meet or what opportunity you're going to come across. And so you want to always be kind of open to that and not, you know, and then that also helps with, you know, anxiety and fear about like not sticking to the plan, or if you stray from your plan, because, you know, everything that happens, you know, it sounds kind of cliche, but it kind of happens for a reason. And so I certainly did not set out to do any of the things that I ended up doing, but I feel incredibly grateful that I had the opportunities, including my work with Movember, which I absolutely love. It's one of my favorite things to do, actually. I would argue even more so than the academic work that I do, although I do love teaching. But Movember has been wonderful. And that also I kind of fell into because of my involvement with a film. It's called The Mask You Live In. Yeah. And it was produced here in the States, and I kind of fell into that opportunity. So it's always nothing that I planned out, nothing that I set out to do, but everything that I'm so grateful for. So I don't know if that helps at all in terms of, you know, advice for younger people trying to plan out their careers. But everything that I've done, I never imagined I would do or plan to do. So
yeah, that's great. I mean, it sort of speaks to, I guess, some agility or some flexibility or some really being, you know, present and aware of the opportunities that are presented to a lot of us, you know, at times, not all the time in our lives, and, you know, conscious that many people are really struggling with life and what might be perceived as lack of opportunities, but certainly, you know, opportunities coming to you, and then, you know, you have a preparation and a willingness to step into those with a degree of authenticity that way leads on to way, which again is a bit of a cliche, but it's a great thing, you know, and it's certainly fascinating, you know, to be on the other side of the world and, you know, to have come across your work and to have been really struck by, I think, some of the things that you're unpacking and that you're working with, particularly around how boys negotiate their identity, and in turn from that, you know, how that can then impact on their behaviour. And so that might be a good little segue for us to talk to. And just for the benefit of the listeners, perhaps if you could sort of give a summary of the main work that you're doing, and certainly the main work in the thesis of your book, that would be a really great place, I think, for us to start.
Okay, let's see. How I came to study boys was kind of, you know, a good example of what I was just saying about not really having things planned out. I think partly it was, you know, after my first year at Harvard and kind of learning about the work that Carol Gilligan was doing with girls and how she was listening to girls. So as much the methods that she was using to learn from girls, but also the theory of this, you know, kind of relational theory and how our relationships are really central to development and how that would make sense in terms of boys' lives as well. Yeah. But, you know, I went back that summer, and my brother, who was 13 at the time, I ended up spending a lot of time driving him and his other 13-year-old friends around. And one of the boys kind of said to me, oh, you know, Harvard, you know, what are you learning there? And so I told him, you know, exactly, like, impress me, you know, if you can. And so I told him, well, actually, you know, for the first time ever, I learned about this woman's work, and this is what she's doing and what she's found with girls. And after hearing my little summary of what I had learned that year, he said, you know, that's great. You know, it's fine. Everyone's really worried about girls and what's going on for them. And that's great, except that nobody's, you know, looking at boys. Nobody, you know, there's stuff going on for us too. We have issues going on. We have problems we're trying to work through, and nobody's focusing on boys. So without saying that they shouldn't, you know, that people shouldn't focus on girls, he goes, you know, someone should look at boys as well. And so then he looks at me and he says, you know what? You should study boys.
Wow.
You can start with me. And so I went, oh my goodness. And so I went back to Harvard that fall, and I happened to be taking an interviewing methods class with Carol. And I mentioned what this boy had said. And she goes, well, for the class, we had assignments where we had to interview kids and things like that. And so she goes, why don't you interview him? Clearly, he has something to say. And so that's actually how I started studying boys, is that I was led to it by boys themselves who said, we have something to say. Nobody's listening to us. And so, why don't you come and listen to us? And because I, like I said, I didn't go to Harvard with an intent, with an agenda of like, oh, I'm going to study this, this, and this. Because I had that benefit of not being focused, I was able to kind of follow him. And with our first interview, he spoke for 2 hours about, everything from his friendships to kind of expectations that other people had of him to expectations that he had for himself. But then that leads to this, the question that you raised about how boys negotiate their identities. That came very much from talking to adolescent boys. So, it started out with my brother's friends, but then I also, in Harvard and in Boston, got kind of made contacts with the local schools there and said, can I come out and just kind of observe your students, talk with them? And this is what adolescent boys said were questions that they had. And so one of the things, my research question very much came out of the questions that they were telling me were on their minds. And so how do they figure out, who they are, their identities as boys, how they could behave and still be, socially acceptable or appropriate, and how they could have relationships with others, how it was possible for them as boys to relate to other people. And so that was very much the kind of driving question, or the overarching question. I started out studying adolescent boys ages 12 to 18, and then the kind of findings that I was coming to led me then to focus on younger boys. And that was very much because I was working with Carol. And basically the finding was that, I was constantly in conversation with Carol, telling her, what they were telling me, what I was finding with them. And one of the things was they had figured out or coming to the conclusion that, the way boys are said to be, kind of boys will be boys kind of thing. And the way versus the way they experience themselves to be were not the same thing. There was a gap between those things. And what the adolescent boys were telling me was that they just had to accept that that's just reality, that people were just going to see you in ways that weren't really who you were. And that part of growing up was just kind of dealing with that and accepting it. And so when I told Carol that this was kind of the conclusion they were coming to, she said, well, maybe you need to go earlier when they're still struggling with that, when they're not feeling like they have to accept that, when they're still really eager to be seen for who they are. And her hypothesis was that what she was seeing in adolescent girls happens for boys at an earlier age. So for instance, she was finding that at early adolescence, girls were going from being very outspoken and saying what they think and feel, kind of outright, to kind of feeling like, having these impositions of cultural expectations around being a nice girl or a perfect girl, and kind of learning to silence or quiet their voices in order to be socially acceptable women. And that was kind of this initiation into kind of patriarchal constructions of gender. But just as, for girls, being a tomboy is okay up until adolescence, when they start to look like women, then people are like, oh, you should act like a young woman. For boys, those kinds of, like sissies and mama's boys, those kind of gender policing terms come in earlier. So you'll hear that, 3, 4, 5-year-old boys, like if a boy is clinging to his mother or even his father, like if they're showing a reliance on their parents, they're somehow, viewed as not being well prepared for their journey toward manhood, right? Like somehow, being a mom, being close to their mothers was a weakness. It was a vulnerability. And so boys were having to, so these kinds of social constructions of gender seem to be impacting boys earlier. And so she really encouraged me to go hang out with younger boys, which I was a little bit fearful to do at first because I felt like kids, I'm all kids of all ages. I feel like they're really smart and really perceptive, but I felt like young kids, especially, like if you're nervous, they know.
They know, Judy, don't they know? They just, I'm a teacher and they can pick the day, they can pick almost down to the millisecond of vulnerability and they just nail you.
And they can read you so clearly, and they're not afraid to tell you they're reading you. So the adolescent boys might still be reading you very, very well, but they know now, oh, you're not supposed to say that you notice someone's sadness, right? You're not supposed to say someone seems upset. You're supposed to help protect their vulnerability. But the young boys will just come out. Like, I think one of the boys in the study actually told his mom one morning, Mom, you seem happy, but you also seem a little sad, and his mom said, and she had enough wherewithal in the moment to say, you're absolutely right. I'm happy that it's a beautiful day, but I'm a little bit worried because I have a lot of work to do. And so the kid, her son says to her, well, I hope you have a good day, Mom. And so just kind of validating that. Whereas, sometimes if a kid notices that a parent is sad, the parent might, in an effort to protect them, say, oh, no, I'm fine. Everything's fine. Right. But then that kind of not violates, but kind of shakes the kid's sense of, oh, did I pick up something wrong, or did I misread it? You know what I mean? And so really allowing boys and girls, or just, all children, to kind of stay with what they know, because they're really good readers of the social world and of their relationships.
It's amazing. It's sort of almost a numbing that goes on, isn't it? And as you're talking, I'm thinking about just how true a lot of that is in terms of the experience of what I observe working with kids. And it's almost like we stunt their ability to be able to vocalize and again talk really about what is happening in the complexity of the emotional world, or what you're seeing in others. And was it your experience in your research that for boys in the first part of your work, in that sort of 12 to 18-year-old bracket, that there was an effect on, I suppose, most emotional literacy because it wasn't socially correct for boys and young men to talk about the emotional realm?
Well, what I found, and which was at the time kind of a little different from what the popular literature was saying, was that they don't, first of all, my work with both ages really revealed or highlighted their relational capabilities, basically what boys are capable of knowing and doing in their relationships, which often gets underestimated or overlooked, partly because of stereotypes that say boys don't do that's a girl thing or it's a feminine thing, but also partly because boys have learned, like you said, not to show it at every minute. Again, because it's associated with femininity. And so they're not sure if it's a safe or socially advantageous thing for them to show. Or sometimes just to respect other people. Like, oh, you're upset and I'm not going to react to that because I don't want you to be embarrassed by that. Like they might do that with their same-sex peers. So one of the things I tried to really highlight in my work with the adolescent boys was, first of all, how very self-aware they were, how sensitive they were to emotions, both their own and other people's, and how attuned they were to like social dynamics and, what was going on in their relationships. But also, kind of how they were very learning also in ways that were socially adaptive, to be strategic about what they showed, strategic and selective about what they showed, what they revealed about themselves, and to whom they showed those things to. Because they found that, you can't just go out and say whatever you're thinking and feeling, because sometimes it's not safe. If their peer group culture happens to be one that emphasizes hierarchy and competition, and they perceive the interactions to be kind of antagonistic, then it's not a wise decision to kind of tell people how you're feeling or to kind of reveal your vulnerability. And so basically, it's kind of coming back to, there are reasons why they do and act the ways they do. And oftentimes they're really good reasons. And so when you look at what they're up against or what they perceive their social reality to be, a lot of their behaviors actually make a lot of sense. But again, contrary to the discourse that had said, oh, well, as a result of their socialization towards cultural constructions of masculinity, they are losing their relational capabilities. What I found was they don't lose them. They learn to hide them or disguise them or only show them to certain people, but those relational capabilities absolutely persist through adolescence.
Great. And so my question in that is, do they continue to grow in their emotional capabilities? Is that possible to know? I'm just wondering if it's not being expressed, if it's not, I guess I'm sort of wondering, is there a bridge between what you're finding and the traditional view? And that might be that, if it's in recess, if it's laid dormant, if it's not vocalized and spoken about and tested and socialized in itself, does it continue to grow, or what happens in that space?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think that it can continue to grow, but only if it is being, expressed in some way. You know what I mean? And so, like, for instance, if they have, even if they're not showing it at all times, if they have a best friend or a friend who they feel like they could confide in, or even a parent. Sometimes when I would ask the adolescent boys, is there anyone who you could talk to if you needed to? And they oftentimes they name a parent, and they say, but don't tell my parent that. Like, don't tell my mom I said that, or else she's going to ask me about everything. And they said it was important to distinguish between whether they actually talked and if they felt like they could. And what seemed to be the protective factor was feeling like they could. Like, I could talk to this person if I wanted to, but I generally don't like to talk about my problems very much or whatever. Yeah. And so how I termed it is like compromise versus over-compromise, where, compromise, we always have to compromise anytime we're engaging with someone else because no one can have their way all the time. And so we compromise our behavior sometimes because, something might not be suitable for the situation. But over-compromise is when we kind of dissociate it from ourselves. We become disconnected from our own self-knowledge. And so what your question about kind of whether this can grow depends on whether it's compromise or over-compromise. Like, is it that they're not showing it, but they're still self-aware? They still know what they think and feel, even though they're not expressing it? Or are they at a point where they're not self-aware anymore? They've had to kind of disconnect from it for whatever reason, sometimes to protect it and to keep it safe. But if they're not able to share it, then that definitely hinders the growth. Hinders their ability to develop those capacities that they're born with. Actually, it goes all the way back to infant research that shows that all humans are born with this fundamental capacity and primary desire to, connect in emotionally intimate and meaningful ways with other people. So then when we start with that fundamental fact, then we look at the course, the trajectory of boys and girls, or just kind of our socialization into kind of civilized society, and what do we give up along the way? As we strive towards success and acceptability and desirability, what do we kind of have to cut off from ourselves, and how can we protect those things? Because our instinct is still to kind of preserve our integrity. So if we can, so the people are really clever actually at finding ways to kind of preserve their vulnerability as they're adapting and making their way through kind of their necessary everyday interactions.
And I guess there's a degree in maturation where you are forming a persona of sorts that you're happy to interact with the world in and use and refine. And we see adolescence as a great time of forming that. I was chatting to my brother the other day, and we're laughing affectionately, mind you, about a friend that we used to have, and one year he'd come out and he was a punk, and the next summer he was a rockabilly, and the next, he was really trying on these different versions of who he was. And the thing that was beautiful about it was that each one of them was just so well crafted. It was really a work of art, and most of it seemed to revolve around his haircut, actually. I just want to come back to, you were talking earlier, Judy, about this gap, and you were saying the boys in the early work, there was this big gap between how they felt that they were and what they were expected to be. Mm-hmm. And I'm just interested in this notion of the gap about what's real and what's not real, because in the education space, there's writers like Graham Nuttall who talk about the secret lives of learners. And in that space, as educators, we're aware of, the role of feedback and the kinds of things that people tell each other, and this almost private world that goes on amongst the student body, and then another one which is the public view. Is that in your work you're seeing? Is that more of a distinction between boys and girls, or is it more of a general factor that there just is in youth? A difference between what we might perceive who we are and what others may see as us as.
I think it's both. I think that, we're all kind of socialized towards socially defined or constructed images, right, that are then specific by, gender, but also by other visible social identities like race and, religion. So there's all these kinds of constructs that inform what we're told we're supposed to be, right? So there's always this push to like, oh, in order to be a good this is what you have to do. And then those are then bifurcated or specific by gender. So, girls are socialized towards one particular image, which happens to be kind of definitions of femininity. So what we think it means to be a good girl or a good woman. And then boys are socialized towards images of, boyhood and manhood, what it means to be a real boy or man. And oftentimes, unfortunately, those are very different lists, right? And so there's this sense, but in both cases, there's always the sense of you need to be something more, you need to be something else in order to have value and to be of worth. And so there's this constant, so it starts in a really weird place in that sense. I don't know if you know who Mr. Fred Rogers is, but we have this wonderful man icon here in the States named who they call Mr. Rogers. And one of the most brilliant things that he did was he would tell on television, there's television, he would tell children.
The television?
Yeah, the television evangelist and education.
Yeah.
And he would tell kids, I like you just the way you are. And it's such a simple message, but, and people sometimes will kind of mock him for being overly simplistic, but I feel like we haven't even gotten that right yet. And if we could get that part right, so many of the problems that we see children dealing with, or, the problematic outcomes that can result from, all of the other things would kind of be solved or avoided. Because I think a lot of times it's this sense of insecurity that comes from feeling like somehow who they are is not enough. And so they have to go and strive to be something else in order for people to like them and to value them and to want to be with them. And so I think for boys in particular, they're told, if you want to prove that you're a real boy, which is, girls aren't as much, at least in the States, aren't as much expected to prove their femininity, although they can certainly be shamed for not being feminine enough. But boys, especially, for starting from a very early age, get these messages about if you want to show that you're of worth, you have to show that you're a real boy. And in order to do that, you have to be, for instance, physically tough and emotionally stoic. And you have to project this image of self-sufficiency. And these are told to 3, 4, 5-year-old boys, which of course it's ridiculous because they, of course, still need to rely on other people. And in fact, throughout our lives,
we do, absolutely.
Exactly. Yeah. Adults need to rely on other people. And so this idea that, maturity and development is indicated by being very separate and standing alone is a very harmful goal to strive towards. And yet it comes in full force, to boys starting at a very early age. And they're made to feel ashamed if they need other people. Even like adolescents or college students are made to feel like, oh, well, aren't you all grown up? Why would you need other people? But of course we need other people because humans are inherently relational. We need our connections to other people. It's actually been shown, studies have shown that it's crucial not only to our mental health, but to our physical health. And so, the misconception that somehow we're supposed to move out of relationship in order to prove ourselves as worthy is a hugely problematic myth that again is taught to all children, but comes in a way that can be especially intense and particularly harmful, problematic for boys, I found.
I have a wondering, Judy, and that is, as flipping all of this on its head, what drives these messages? If there was a person or people kind of creating, these standards or norms or modern myths around, or perhaps they're 20, 30 years old now. What are some of the kind of icons or some of the drivers that kind of permeate these myths that necessitate this this dissociation from the real self into this kind of projected, gendered ideal?
Oh my goodness, that's a great question. It's a huge question. And there's actually, if I could just mention, there's a book that very well addresses that question that was written by Carol Gilligan and Naomi Snyder actually just last year, called Why Does Patriarchy Persist? And they talk about it in terms of, kind of patriarchy and particularly the hierarchy, social hierarchies, and how we maintain those hierarchies, not only by gender, but also by race and by class, and kind of how we set it up, and of course it's in certain groups' interest to preserve those hierarchies. Even the people who are at the lower ends of those hierarchies are led to feel invested in it because it's almost like they're kind of socialized to believe that if they do these things, then they'll reap certain rewards. They'll have, even if those rewards are to have a place in society. And so it is not even necessary to say like, oh, they'll reap the rewards of being at the top of the hierarchy. It's more just to have even a place, a sense of belonging within those hierarchies. So like a lot of the boys who, for instance, to bring it back to the things I know most directly, the boys that I observe, why do they, engage in these messages that they don't quite buy into, right? but then it feels like such a risk. Yeah. Right. They do it because it feels like such a risk to deviate from it. Right. And they know that, and it's not just their perception of it, because they see how boys who are different or who are, who don't quite fit in, how they can get ridiculed or excluded. And of course, they don't want to put themselves at risk. So there's a lot at stake for them of not buying into these norms. My students at Stanford ask all the time, like, why do we keep doing this when we know that these archaic messages about masculinity, there are studies that show that they are harmful? Why do we continue to, if not celebrate them, at least perpetuate them? And it's partly because it's been so ingeniously set up that to even start to challenge those feels linked to huge risks, personal risks of like, if I don't do these things, then I won't get what's coming to me. But what's driving these messages, what Gilligan and Snyder talk about, is that in a way it's a self-defense. So not just, so it's not just like this patriarchal culture telling them what to do, because people can rebel openly against that, because that feels too like a dictatorship. But that why do individuals continue to perpetuate and uphold these things? And that's because it's a self-defense mechanism, and it protects us from loss, because we know that when we are open, when we are connected, there's the possibility of being rejected and being lost. And that vulnerability feels like it's so unbearable, or we can't, we don't feel comfortable enough being vulnerable in those ways, that we would rather conform to something that we're promised will work rather than kind of venture out on our own. So to put it in terms of what the boys are going through, it's like they're told that if you, align with these norms of masculinity, then you'll be socially acceptable and you'll have social success and you'll have the advantages of being male and masculine in our society, which happens to prize men and masculinity.
Okay, so what's great. So what's pinging from you here is that whether it's design or otherwise, what is happening is that they're still consistently seeing the rewards for this way of being, even though it's alien to who they might feel they really are. They still see it as a way of being which is ultimately about being successful, about being connected, and about fitting somewhere on a hierarchy where they know they don't want to be, no one wants to be on the bottom rung of the ladder. Everyone wants to keep, we have a drive, a primal drive to improve and get better. And is that sort of what you're saying?
Yes, but then there's also a story beneath that story, because that's the kind of story is like, oh, well, boys are told by society and culture to be, to be masculine, and so they strive toward it. But again, that's not really what's driving their behaviors. What I found in my studies, what the boys were kind of talking about, was actually had more to do again with their relational capabilities and the fact that they're seeking connections and resisting disconnection. So the fact that they're motivated, their behaviors are motivated by their desire to connect in meaningful ways with their peers, with other people. And they're told that in order to have these relationships that they crave, the way to get relationships is to conform to social norms or social expectations. Right. But sadly, the paradox is that actually, when they align themselves with those masculine norms of toughness, stoicism, self-sufficiency, they actually make it less likely that they will actually develop the relationships that they're seeking. So they're motivated by the desire for relationships, but the trajectory that they're told will lead to those relationships actually leads them away from those relationships. Mm-hmm. And so it's this terrible, kind of this terrible dilemma. One of my students described it as it's a trap, right? Mm. So they're told that, they're told, oh, you want relationships? This is how you do it. And if they actually step foot on that path, they actually walk away, make it more difficult. Or one of the boys' fathers that I interviewed with, the younger boy, said, it's ironic that, the very things they're told that in the name of masculinity, they have to hide, all their tenderness, their sensitivities, all these things that make them too, quote unquote, feminine. The father says, those are the things that are the most charming and appealing about the boys. So to tell them to kind of shut down those things in the name of proving their masculinity, in the name of, being successful by masculine standards, and even in the name of acquiring the social, the relationships that they're driven to seek, that they actually want, following, again, that socially prescribed path actually leads them away from the very things that they desire most.
Yeah, it's so many layers to it, isn't it? And, I did a project a few years ago now, quite a few years ago. I was working in a girls' school, and we were looking at a similar territory in the sense about What was it that society was telling them to be and to grow into? And they constructed a performance, and the performance was about a factory that made perfect girls. And we used it as a vehicle to explore, we use stories like the Cinderella story about, what is it, the beauty myth. And, we looked at Baba Yaga as the kind of the great mother. And we sort of had all these amazing, almost archetypal stories that we'd built into this fabric. And there was this key moment when we were workshopping, who was it that was driving this message of the billboards and the media and the television and all the images that the kids, even 10, 15 years ago when we did it, we're constantly being bombarded with. And I never forget it, we're in this room and we said, okay, so let's set it up as if this is it, we're in the factory, this is the place where they make all this stuff, right? And we opened the door and then we went in into this chair and we're like, let's turn it around, let's see who's in the chair. And of course there's nobody in the chair. And it was such a scary thought, I think, for the group that, there is this sense. And I think the writer John Ralston Saul, in his book, The Unconscious Civilization, which I read a number of years ago as well, had a similar sort of thesis in a sense. And that was that, who's really driving the ship on some of these things, and where is the leadership coming from? And this is why I think, frankly, Judy, the work that you're doing is so important, because it's actually shining a light into some of the complexities that as parents we struggle with, as teachers, in sort of starting to set up new dialogues and discourse and liberating as much as we can these incredibly relationally capable kids, and obviously the focus in this podcast is about boys, and setting them up in a way where they can maybe, break new ground and, deal with some of the challenges of the messages that they're getting and the dichotomous nature of some of the messages that they're also getting. Can I ask you a bit about your work again? We've talked a little tiny bit about I like to call them the little tackers. It's an Australian expression. The little tackers, so the younger kids that you worked with. And I've ordered your book, and I apologize, it hasn't come yet. It hasn't come out. The people that I use to get my books through, I think they're based overseas. So it's on its way, but it's going to be a great read. But can you tell us a little bit about what they talked about, these young kids, and how aware they were about, the material that we're sort of discussing, and perhaps even what are some of the costs? Because as I understand it, they're aware of some of the costs of things that they're giving up. Is that right?
Yeah, I think they understand a lot more than, adults generally give them credit for. I think because of their smaller size, we tend to undervalue or discount what they're. But they're incredible. Obviously, and they're incredibly insightful. They're really, really attuned. In many ways, very similarly to the adolescent boys that are talking. Not to insult either group, but say I'm not saying that. But they have. Obviously, the adolescent boys have more experience and more years of being able to articulate their experiences. But the younger boys were highly aware, very, very astute. And, what they would talk about a lot was just kind of what they were picking up in people, their relationships, why this person is doing that thing, and what they knew. And one of the things, and also what they were feeling at every moment. And they were super aware of that. So they would kind of, there's expression, wearing their hearts on their sleeves. You never really had to guess at what they meant, because they would tell you exactly what they meant. Yeah. And it was really refreshing. And in a way, I think for the adults, almost like, adults would sometimes get kind of taken aback. Like we would, because Carol and I also met with the parents and the fathers, at the same time, they'd had this dilemma. They experienced this dilemma because at the same time that they loved how out there, how kind of, they called it the boys spunk, just kind of this energy, like, here I am, 100%. And that would make the father, at the same time that the fathers loved that, it also made them feel like, oh my, wanting to shield that vulnerability, because they knew that being that open really, made their sons vulnerable to being teased, because but the boys would talk about whatever they were thinking, whatever they really thought, and they were aware of everything. Like, oh, this person, one of them noticed his friend seeming a little bit sullen while they were playing, very, very, very slightly. So he said, oh, you don't seem very happy today. And the kid says, and this is, what's so impressive is that the kid actually admits it. He goes, yeah, I'm sad because I miss my mom. And the first kid says, well, that's okay, because you still have your friends. And then they continue to play. And so there's no like, I'm going to solve this problem for you. But there was just kind of this like, I noticed this in you. I'm going to say it. You're going to validate it. And we validate it in each other. And then we move on. And there, or just kind of things that we don't observe as much with adults. Because, again, we feel like, oh, well, we shouldn't say that we notice that someone's upset. Or if we say it, then they're not going to admit it to us. But there's none of that kind of need to second guess. Or another thing, like there was like a conflict where these two boys are playing. A third boy came in and kind of knocked out one of the first boys. Like they just excluded him. And so the boy who was knocked out was kind of upset about this, right? And he started to say, hey, we were playing here. It's not that he didn't want the third boy to join them, but he's like, it's not really fair that you're now excluding me. And so it was a confrontation, right? And of course, adults immediately respond to that as, oh no, this is going to escalate into something horrible. And so the teacher immediately swooped in and was trying to keep the kids, the first kid from confronting. She was trying to distract him, trying to, lead him away, like, oh, why don't we go do something else and whatever. But the first kid was very persistent, which of course then made the teacher more nervous that he was going to do something really bad. But then finally, when the teacher got distracted, the first kid comes back and says to the third kid, I don't like what you did. That wasn't really fair. It wasn't nice. And the third kid hears him, and then they continue playing together, and so it's like kind of like all these things that adults are really sensitive to, because we think we have our own connotations, we have our own beliefs about what they mean. Sometimes when we let them play it out, it's not as, it doesn't go in as scary a direction as we think. So, but again, the kids learn these things like, oh, look at how the adult is responding to me when I'm just trying to tell him what I'm thinking, right? So it's perceived as a threat. And so all the ways that we respond to kids constitutes feedback that they then take into consideration as they negotiate their behaviors in the future, to always trying to kind of anticipate, is this okay to say this? Can I say this without getting in trouble? Can I say this without people getting worried that I'm going to do something bad? And these are the things that they kind of explained to me. Like I would tell them, I was never a boy, so I'm just trying to understand what it's like to be a boy. And so they would explain. And then they had this whole thing, which you'll see in my book, which is they had created something called the mean team, which is another perfect example of something that adults would hear and say, oh, well, that's terrible. We shouldn't let them have a mean team. But, if you start to hear it from their perspectives, first of all, they actually thought it could be the good team. But they had learned from kind of social messages in the air that boys are supposed to be the opposite of girls. And if the girls are good or nice, then the boys have to be the opposite. So they must be bad or mean. And they didn't want to be the bad team. So they became the mean team. So it's just kind of the thing of like, it's not like they set out saying like, we want to be mean and therefore we're going to create a team. But they said, we have this team, but oh wait, the social rules tell us we're supposed to be, that, gender is exclusive by sex and mutually exclusive. And so if the girls are this and we're not, and we don't want to be girls, then this is what we need to be by default.
We put our stake in the ground. Yeah. There's so many I remember childhood limericks, which I won't repeat, but similar, certainly in Australia anyway, about girls are this and boys are that, or girls do this, so boys must do that. And it's amazing, left unchallenged, just how formative that could be, in your mind and how, talking earlier about, forming and negotiating your identity and what you're going to be and who you're going to become and where that sits within the whole idea of gender. It's so powerful, isn't it? What advice would you give parents, particularly parents of young boys in this space when they're starting to hear some of these things?
I think most of the advice that I have comes from the advice that the boys' parents kind of from talking to the boys' parents and seeing, especially the ones that seem to be faring well in terms of kind of nurturing a healthy resistance. So like that boy that I was saying like was quote unquote confrontational. His parents very much would say to him things like, if you don't want to do it, then don't. If all the other kids are doing this and you don't want to do it, then don't. And so they very much gave him language and permission to kind of know what he knows and to be true to himself. And he knew that they always had, he always had their support and so I think that helped him tremendously. Actually, after, because that particular study came out years ago, I actually had a chance to talk with that boy after he grew up and was in his 20s. And,
Right.
I would ask him, what was the impact? And of course, he continued throughout his educational career to kind of come up against, teachers who wanted him just to comply and to be a certain way. And he wasn't a bad kid. I mean, he was smart and he was more or less compliant, but it's just kind of, he didn't always fit that kind of sit there and don't move and just nod and, kind of a very constraining idea of what it meant to be a student. He was very creative and he wanted to say what he thought, and his parents very much welcomed that. And so he, when I interviewed him again, kind of informally, or actually we just had coffee together, when he was in his 20s, he said, well, that really made a difference for him. Even though it didn't prevent him from having troubles, it made him know that, he would endure it. He could persist. He would get through it. He would be all right. That, the world wasn't, necessarily right about him, that there was something that, again, coming back to that gap between societal expectations and how they fit, what they knew to be true of who they were from their experiences of themselves. That kind of validation from someone like a parent or a friend or a teacher, or a mentor, that was hugely protective as they came up against, continually throughout in different periods of their lives. Whenever they came up against people who would say, oh, well, you're this, or who wanted to dismiss them or degrade them in one way or another, that provided a foundation that they carried with them to kind of resist external pressures to kind of be something else and something other than what they felt was right for them.
Yeah, wow. So and in that, I guess it speaks to role models as well, doesn't it? About, kids seeing particular ways of being modeled by people. And I guess that's the question I wanted to ask you about being good and being a good man these days. What do you think, maybe not even just as a researcher, but just as a person, human being, in the world at the moment, what does it take to be a good man these days?
Oh my goodness. I think, I'm going to look at how you phrased that question, was what does it take? So more, I think it's giving boys permission to care. In some ways, not that they're ever taught explicitly don't care about this, but for instance, in adolescence interviews, you'll see in girls an increase with each year that they grow older, that you start to hear, I don't know, because girls aren't supposed to be too smart. They're not supposed to seem like know-it-alls, or else they'll seem bossy and it won't be attractive or whatever. So girls, you start to see I don't know sprinkled throughout their interviews. For the boys, I was seeing I don't care. Like, oh, then they would be mean to you, but, I don't really care. Or, oh, then you can, so whatever, I don't care means that you can't touch me because, I'm not going to show you any vulnerability. And so this kind of push to not reveal their vulnerabilities, which are deemed feminine and therefore weaknesses, that boys learn that they're not supposed to care. But that, of course, hurts them immensely. I mean, so the idea to be a good man is giving them, kind of renewing permission to care about themselves, to care about other people, which of course is good for their, their physical and mental health, but also their relationships, which are important to their physical and mental health. Giving them permission, in helping them to feel, what does it take to be a good man? It takes helping them to feel valued and accepted as they are, helping them to stay connected to themselves in terms of like preserving their sense of integrity and agency and efficacy, and also connected to other people, their social connections and their relationships to the community, and also to the wider world. I think that so it's not so much a matter of like saying, oh, well, this was the list of how to be a good man, and now there's a new list. And if you just do this new list, because then that's still like an externally prescribed, right?
Just download the new program
Good Man
from somewhere.
2.0. Yeah. Right?
Yeah.
No, because it used to be like, oh, a good man is, let's say, well, I don't know if this was a good man, but it used to be like, oh, a real man is a macho man. Right. And so for a while, there was this image of the macho tough guy, and that's what a real man, what it meant to be a man. And then they moved over to actually a real man is sensitive. Right. But again, it's not so much about telling people how they should be, but really helping them to kind of stay in the moment and to be fully present. Right. Yeah. And to be true to themselves in the best way that they can. And it's going to be, and it's not like there's this one true self and that, then you're the same way with everyone and in every situation, but just kind of that ability to realize and express a full range of whatever qualities you are, who make you who you are. And so, some people may be more shy, right? So being true to themselves means, not talking that much, but that's not a bad thing. So like, it's not so much to be like, oh, well, then you should always, talk about your feelings, because some people honestly don't feel better talking about their feelings. So they should have that option. So it's not, again, it's not replacing one list with another, but just giving them permission to do what feels right and comfortable, for them. Because then the other thing too was like, I would have these students, for instance, these athletes in my class who would kind of be worried at one point, and they'd be like, well, I look like that stereotypical guy. I'm muscular, I'm tough. I tend not to talk a lot because I choose not to talk a lot, but I could if I wanted to. But is that a problem that I look like, this man that everyone's saying is a problem? And I'm like, oh, absolutely not. Because, it's not that masculinity is inherently problematic. It's only when we feel compelled to distort ourselves in order to meet an externally imposed image of masculinity or whatever we're told is a good person, a good mother, a good father. There's all these different identities that come with. Are you a good this? Are you a good friend? Are you a good brother? Are you a good boyfriend or whatever? All these things come with this. Again, socially prescribed. Somebody else decided that what would constitute that list, and so really giving people permission to trust themselves and to be themselves and to kind of stick with what they're inclined to do. Usually is a good start. Telling them that, if we can, and it's not, I guess one of the things I always say is it's not about, turning them into girls, which is always the fear of like, oh, if we let them be sensitive or in touch with their emotions, then we're just turning them into girls. And first of all, that's just not true, because that's emotions and sensitivity are not exclusive to girls. And it's not about, teaching them something something new. But it's about just helping them to stay connected to what, to qualities and skills that they were actually born with. Again, coming back to the infant studies, they're born with the desire and the ability to establish and maintain close relationships with other people, mutual, responsive, connections with other people. They have this, they were intuitive in that. It's intuitive and instinctive, and it's not female. It's human. And so that's why I talk about, relational strengths are not feminine weaknesses, but human strengths. Right. So relational capabilities are not feminine weaknesses, but human strengths, because it's something that, serves them well throughout their lives, in their professional as well as their personal relationships. It's, and when they don't have that, it puts them at huge risk for everything from, loneliness and isolation to poor life satisfaction, discontentment, just all these things happen when we feel like nobody knows who we really are. You could have 5,000 Facebook friends or whatever, and you could still feel very alone. You could be at a party with hundreds of people and still feel like nobody really sees you or knows you. And so it's not just about like being in isolation, like you're literally in a room by yourself, but just feeling like nobody really knows you. Is a problem. But, again, and then I think your question is so powerful and so important about what drives these messages, because that actually leads to what's the solution, right? Yeah. And I think you're absolutely right that we're, in a way, obviously, when we want to solve these problems, we have to both empower individuals and shift social norms. But the social norms are perpetuated and by individuals, right? And so individuals, in a way, we can empower individuals to shift the social norms. And so, and there's this kind of thing, and when you were talking earlier about, I love the example you gave of your study with the factories producing perfect girls, because there's this kind of notion in social psychology called pluralistic ignorance. And it's a little bit like, the emperor has no clothes, that one, like kind of this, everybody thinks that everyone else believes one thing and that they're the only one who doesn't buy into it or is struggling with it or whatnot. But in fact, nobody really buys into it, but because no one's speaking up and complaining about it, they just continue, to perpetuate this myth or this kind of misrepresentation of the way that things are, when people's actual lived experiences are much more in common with everyone else's actual lived experience. But again, that gap that we're forced to kind of, well, not forced, but led to say, oh, well, if I'm mature, then I'm going to accept that this gap just exists. So that keeps us from talking to each other, right? It keeps us from complaining, because if we complain, then it's a problem with us and not with the system. But if we start to talk, and again, this is where the connections and kind of the connections to yourself and the connections to other people come in, is the minute you find out that somebody else is thinking this too, then you're not alone anymore, right? And so that's kind of the connection, to be very, very simplistic, is kind of the solution, is if we can keep and help individuals to stay connected to themselves. And that would be the tip for parents. If I had any tips for parents, was just, and also for parents to stay true to themselves too, because there's a huge pull as parents. First of all, there's always constant worry, like, am I doing a good job? I worry about this every day, like, am I messing them up? Am I doing the best things for them? And so there's huge insecurity, because there's that whole, like, how to be a good parent image that we're trying to strive towards too. But if we can stay connected to ourselves and know that we have our kids' best interests at heart, we know them better than anyone else, and we are more willing to fight for them than anyone else in their lives most of the time, then we can trust ourselves to say, I know my kid, and they're going to, and it's okay that they're doing this, and that they're not, doing what everyone else is doing. And that's okay. And they don't have to be, they don't have to be what other people expect when other people expect it of them. I mean, I'm not saying, like, I'm not trying to create, like, anarchy in the classroom. Obviously, when the teacher is trying to get everyone in order, there's a certain, within a certain range of, it's reasonable to expect everyone to kind of eventually get together. But I'm just saying more in terms of coming down to whether they can like themselves,
Yeah, and I guess it's what I'm hearing. It's an inside out rather than outside in, isn't it? And I think what really resonated with me was when you said, both boys and girls, with those responses, I don't know versus I don't care. It's pretty clear in Australia, and I'm sure it would be very similar in the States, that, one of the greatest predictors of life success is actually, your education and how you continue to be a learner in your life. And that really is, the basis of that is very much, based around care, concern, and care and concern of yourself and your growth. And beginning that virtuous cycle of life to, continue to be someone and to live fully into who you are. I had one last question for you, Judy, which was, if you had a story that you could tell a boy, and it could be a story, it could be advice, what would it be?
I think it would be that, based on the interviews that I've done with hundreds of boys, usually at the end of the interview, I will ask all of them, because I've been asking them so many questions, do they have a question for me? And about 99% of the time, what they would ask is, am I the only one? Am I the only one struggling with these, expectations that people have of me? Am I the only one who feels like I don't quite fit in, that I have to work really hard to fit in because everyone else seems like they're fine. Everyone else seems to be cool and, have it all together. Am I the only one who's, having a hard time? And I always love telling them, you're absolutely not the only one. Every single boy, I've interviewed asks me this question. And so you're totally not alone. I think I don't know if you're familiar with the film that I mentioned earlier, The Masculinity, but one of the things love about that, what I love about that film is that when they show that in schools, all the boys in that auditorium immediately know that they're not the only one. Because you have this whole, 90 minutes of people talking about how they've struggled with that. So then, because I think one of the things, like you were saying about, like, what drives these messages is, again, like, not letting individuals talk to, when individuals don't talk to each other, then they think they're the only one who is a problem. Then they feel like the problem is with them. And in fact, there's a tendency to, sometimes to even blame the individuals, to be like, oh, well, if you're not, man enough, then there's something wrong with you. And there's there's lesser of an inclination to question, like, maybe the things that we're asking of them aren't very humane things, aren't very good for them, aren't conducive to their happiness and their health. And one of those things, and to kind of circle back to the point you were just making previously about, like, learning being a lifelong process, I'm working on a chapter right now which kind of talks about that. Like, kind of when we look at boys' relational capabilities, of course, if they're taught to hide them or to not develop them, not to grow those capabilities, that will definitely hurt their relationships. But it also, that when you pair that with this kind of expectation that they not ever reveal vulnerability, then it not only impacts their relationships, it also impacts their learning, because learning, as you know, is an inherently vulnerable process. So if boys are supposed to act confident and in control all the time, that's going to impact how open they can be in the classroom as well as with other people. And that's going to hurt them in those, so not just their relational outcomes, the relationships, experiences, but also their educational outcomes. Because if you are compelled to kind of always keep up your guard and to maintain this image of like, cool, calm, and in control, then learning, which is a messy process and involves making mistakes and feeling embarrassed and frustrated and all these really vulnerable feelings, can feel very risky or even too risky when for boys who are very, very invested in maintaining a certain image of masculinity that doesn't allow for that kind of, we could call it flexibility, we could call it flaws, but I mean, when I talk about it in terms of flaws, I mean flaws that everyone has, human flaws. And so it's definitely in their interest to kind of, one thing that educators can do is to kind of create these spaces in which they feel like they can be, first of all, these learning communities in which it's safe for them because they feel trusted and they feel that the people that are surrounding them are trustworthy, and that there's respect and there's acceptance and inclusion. And so it enables them to then be vulnerable so that they can be, kind of genuine in their relationships and really learning in the most optimal sense.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Judy Chu, it has been an amazing conversation. I think we've covered a lot of ground. Certainly for our listeners, a lot to think about, a lot to unpack and wrestle with, and some of these questions which we don't yet fully know the answer. But I just wanted to firstly again thank you so much for your generosity in being interviewed today, and to secondly just to wish you well. The work that you're doing is so crucial to challenging some of these areas, some of these misnomers, some of these myths, some of these cultural and story-based factors that really do impact on young men and boys and the people that they are becoming. And to live more intently into who they are, to be comfortable in their own skins, and to freely develop the people that they want to be is so crucial, not only for them as individuals, but for us as a society as we hopefully continue to evolve into a better one. So again, our thanks here from Understanding Boys for your time today.
Thank you so much. I thought your questions were wonderful, and I wish I could have heard more from you, because everything that you said, I learned a lot. I learned a lot from listening to you, and I was really inspired by the example that you're setting at your school. And I wish you very well with all of the families that you're working with, because I know that they're incredibly lucky to have somebody so thoughtful and so in tune with what their needs are in order to not just survive their childhoods, but to really thrive.
Well, we hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Understanding Boys podcast. Make sure you subscribe on your podcast app, and please leave us a review to help grow the community. For more information about the podcast, visit understandingboys.com.au. Until next time, thanks for listening.